promises to be a really interesting talk. Before turning duties over to Kathleen Okrulik to introduce our speaker today, I just want to remind you of upcoming events that are being hosted by the Rotman Institute. So next week we're hosting a workshop, co-hosting it with the Minnesota Center for the Philosophy of Science on the language of nature. That will start Thursday of next week and go through Sunday. And our next speaker in the Rotman Speaker Series will be Lainey Ross from the University of Chicago, who will be here on November 2nd to speak about deceased donor kidney allocation. But now I'll turn things over to Kathleen Okrulik for today's speaker.
Thanks, Chris, and welcome back, everybody, to the Rotman Lecture Speaker Series. This year, 2012, marks, of course, the 50th anniversary of the publication of Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolution. And we're very fortunate to have George Reich here to help us mark that event. He's best known for his 2005 book, How the Cold War Transformed the Philosophy of Science. It was published by Cambridge, and it has the lovely title, To the Icy Slopes of Logic, which signals the transformation that took place at that time. So what George is working on now is the socio-political context in which Kuhn's book was written. And today he's going to draw on some of the research that he's done already in order to present this talk with the provocative title, The Paranoid Style of American History of Science. So please join me in welcoming George Reich.
Thank you very much. I don't know if I need this. I guess I'll just point it at me. That's suffice. Well, thank you very much for your introduction, Kathleen, and thanks for this invitation to be here. As you can see, I'll be talking about what I'm calling the paranoid style in American history of science, and that goes to Thomas Kuhn's famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And I want to begin by discussing the question of the historiographic style in which Kuhn wrote the book, because that is a clue, I think, to its genesis. I will then be moving to the source of my title, Richard Hofstadter's famous essay, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, and discuss that in a little bit of detail, because I'm going to be arguing that what Hofstadter sees in the American political scene, you can also see in Kuhn's historiography of science. So my central claim is that Kuhn's structure borrows elements of this style, including what I'm going to call the brainwashing idea. And very briefly, the brainwashing idea is the thesis that an idea in one's mind can control the rest of the mind, including disabling its critical faculties, which would tell that mind that it is being controlled by a particular idea. To motivate this, I will be talking a bit about the American political scene in the 1950s, including the brainwashing sensation, and I'm focusing on the 1950s because Kuhn conceived and wrote this book beginning in the late 40s and through the 1950s. So if I'm right that Kuhn borrows elements of this style, the obvious question is, well, how exactly did that happen? And I'm going to try to trace one path of influence through the ongoing controversy over communist professors, and I want to show you how what I'm calling the brainwashing idea also plays out in that context, and that's occurring under Kuhn's nose. So I don't think it's a great leap to suppose that when I say he borrowed this idea, he didn't go looking for it, it was there. So the conventional wisdom holds that this book offered a revolutionary critique of existing scholarship about science, as you know. And it did so by appealing to history of science. As Kuhn announced in the famous first sentence of his book, history, if viewed as a repository for more than anecdote or chronology, could produce a decisive transformation in the image of science by which we are now possessed. Yet surely it was not history alone, what Kuhn went on to call in the next few sentences the historical record of the research activity itself, that corrected our understanding of science. For every historian must have a style, a according to which the unbounded, amorphous complexity of the past is reduced and transformed into plausible narratives, or in Structure's case studies of the history of science. The historical past presented to us in Structure, therefore, speaks to us through Kuhn, necessarily, through his personal biases, his intellectual goals, as well as the many factors that make all individuals, I think, regardless of how independent or creative they are, children of their time. Kuhn's time, when he was writing this book, from the late 1940s until its publication in 1962, was remarkable and extreme. The American public, as well as many intellectuals, were gripped by fears that communism was making inroads into American society, and that democracy, Christianity, education, and other institutions could at any moment suddenly be eliminated or transformed. Headlines routinely described Russian spies, such as the Rosenbergs in the upper right, who were in fact executed in the early 50s. And secret communists in government were also headlines that were stoked, for example, by McCarthy and J. Edgar Hoover. As a series of advertisements from Canadair illustrates, the vigorous anti-communist movement was not confined to the United States. Here it is in a series of full-page ads that appeared in Maclean's and other magazines addressing the problem of communism in education, the communist plot for world revolution, and the communist threat to Christianity. All the while advertising an airplane building business. So you can see how deeply this got into the fabric, the economic fabric of North American culture. Now, these and other excesses of McCarthyism and the Cold War may seem remote and disconnected from the development of Kuhn's then emerging image of science. Yet the origins of Structure, as well as central elements of its style and content, cannot be fully understood, I maintain, apart from these anti-communist anxieties and the underlying assumptions about human knowledge that made them seem plausible. The connections include Kuhn's relationship to Harvard President James B. Conant, who first sparked Kuhn's interest in history of science, and from whom Kuhn learned how to craft case studies. Kuhn worked and taught side by side with Conant in Harvard's general education program. But Conant was keenly interested in politics and diplomacy and would soon become the United States ambassador to West Germany, at a time when the divided city of Berlin in East Germany was for many the epicenter of Cold War tensions between liberalism and communism. Conant was also a central figure in national debates and scandals involving ideological loyalty of intellectuals, such as the physicist Robert Oppenheimer, who Conant recruited for the Manhattan Project, and then faced a series of trials and inquisitions in the 1950s. Harvard itself was also an important arena in which the nation struggled with the problem of communist faculty and the epistemological question at its core. Namely, was it true, as anti-communists such as Sidney Hook and eventually James Conant himself came to believe, that communist faculty, most of whom, by the way, had become communists in the ideologically tolerant 1930s, was it true that they were unfit to teach, specifically because their very abilities to think clearly and critically had been compromised by this particular ideology? Now, unlike Conant, Thomas Kuhn studiously kept his professional scholarship separate from his political opinions and his beliefs. Yet his historiography of science nonetheless bears important marks of this complex national obsession with the fragility of liberalism and the widespread presumption that individuals, or perhaps an entire nation, could quickly and easily fall into communism's clutches and be transformed. One trace of this preoccupation in Kuhn's book is a narrative style that was named by the historian, or really co-opted by me, but originally named by the historian Richard Hofstadter in his classic essay from 1964, The Paranoid Style in American Politics. So here I'm going to look at several elements of this style as they apply to Kuhn's structure. One element I'm calling an axiom. It is the axiom that fundamental change, whether that's in politics or history of science, is revolutionary and total. This revolutionary axiom, in turn, supports a set of claims about the nature of political or scientific beliefs, such as that they are holistic, non-decomposable, and incompatible with alternatives. It is impossible, for example, to be both a communist and a liberal democrat in this political scene, just as it is impossible, according to Thomas Kuhn, to be an adherent of two different paradigms at once, or even two different parts. Two parts of two different paradigms. Another claim concerns the human mind and its relationship to the ideas inside it. I call this claim the brainwashing idea. It holds that ideas themselves can have special and sometimes total power over the human mind and consequently human behavior. So Hofstadter's essay appeared in Harper's Magazine in 1964, about 2 years after Kuhn's book came out. So to be sure, Hofstadter did not have Kuhn's book in mind, or even current academic trends. But he was keenly interested in the status of ideas and intellectualism in the United States. His doctoral dissertation had been about social Darwinism, and a year before this essay appeared, he published his classic book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. In this essay, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, his goal was to contextualize the extreme political right, then epitomized by Senator McCarthy, and McCarthy's claim that, quote, card-carrying communists had secretly infiltrated Washington. The presidential campaign of that year, namely from the campaign of Barry Goldwater, also had similar conspiratorial claims. And this is what Hofstadter was to address. His goal was to reassure us. Despite the press's tendency to sensationalize, his essay explained, these developments were not a new and ominous pathology in American life. Instead, they were symptomatic of a regular and recurring style of political thought. McCarthy's famous warnings, for example, about, quote, a conspiracy on a scale so immense as to dwarf any previous such venture in the history of man, end quote, were echoes of 19th century claims about scheming Jesuits, or 18th century claims about Masons and the philosophy of Illuminism that supposedly controlled their conspiratorial goals. The paranoid style, Hofstadter explained, is an old and recurrent phenomenon. So it is not the end of the world. Now, some features of this style, as Hofstadter described it, should seem familiar to readers of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. First, the notion that change, when it comes, will be sudden and drastic, never incremental. As Hofstadter put it, the paranoid spokesman sees the fate of conspiracy in apocalyptic terms. He traffics in the birth and death of whole worlds, whole political orders, whole systems of human values. He is always manning the barricades of civilization. He constantly lives at a turning point. Another element is Hofstadter's repeated use of the word whole here in this quotation to characterize what appears to be at stake for his paranoid politicians, which is, of course, everything. And the related claim that change must be apocalyptic and total because these whole orders, these whole systems of values are felt to be incompatible with their alternatives. He wrote, perhaps the central situation conducive to the diffusion of the paranoid tendency is a confrontation of opposed interests which are, or are felt to be, totally irreconcilable and thus by nature not susceptible to the normal political processes of bargain and compromise. So for the paranoia that Hofstadter is describing, a political paranoia, there is a reason manifest in this holistic and exclusionary conception of values and beliefs for why one can rationally be paranoid. Now clearly, I want to emphasize, so I'll say it again, clearly, some features of this paranoid style do not apply to Thomas Kuhn or to his famous book. Most scientists in its pages are normal scientists who are neither suspicious nor discontent with the scientific status quo. For them, scientific revolutions belong to the past, not to the future, so they share none of the psychological and emotional paranoia that Cold War politicians routinely stoke to achieve some of their goals. Nor are Kuhn's scientific revolutions quite the same as the political revolutions feared by Hofstadter's paranoids. Kuhn's science is professional science, a way of life that exists inside and largely insulated from the surrounding social and political culture. Yet, as the title Kuhn chose for his book suggests, he conceived the dynamics of scientific change by analogy with the dynamics of political revolution. And his defense of this analogy hinged on the same central situation that Hofstadter detected inside the political paranoid style, namely the perception that competing goals and interests are irreconcilable and exclusive, so that what Hofstadter called normal political processes become ineffective. In Kuhn's case, this is the distinction between normal science and revolutionary science. Kuhn wrote in Structures, like the choice between competing political institutions, that choice between competing paradigms proves to be a choice between incompatible modes of community life. Because it has that character, the choice is not and cannot be determined merely by evaluative procedures characteristic of normal science. Scientific change, Kuhn explained, must be revolutionary because scientific paradigms, just like the whole orders and the whole systems of values that Hofstadter described, are holistic, self-contained, and incompatible with others. The rise of one requires its predecessor to become obsolete and to go away. And as we know, given the power of textbooks in Kuhn's model of science, the power of textbooks to rewrite scientific history, detailed in his chapter called The Invisibility of Scientific Revolutions, these revolutions are then largely forgotten by posterity. So it's the comprehensive, monolithic qualities of paradigms that led Kuhn to claim in Structure's longest chapter that, quote, when paradigms change, the world itself changes with them. At least in this metaphorical sense, then, Kuhn joined Hofstadter in conceiving of change in apocalyptic, world-destroying, and world-creating terms, and doing so for similar reasons. So for Hofstadter, the brainwashing sensation of the 1950s was just another example of the paranoid's suspicious, exaggerated fears. He wrote, very often the enemy, the political enemy, is held to possess some especially effective source of power. He controls the press. He has unlimited funds. He has a new secret for influencing the mind, parenthesis, brainwashing. Hofstadter's readers would have been familiar with brainwashing because it was ubiquitous in American popular and political culture from the onset of the Korean War in 1950. This war greatly advanced anti-communist anxiety in America because the invasion of South Korea by Northern and Manchurian forces was widely seen as concrete evidence of Moscow's plans for world domination. At the same time, Americans were disturbed by reports about American GIs who, after being captured in this conflict, collaborated with their captors, murdered fellow soldiers, and subsequently refused repatriation to the United States when it was offered. These GIs, in other words, had become transformed into communists somehow. Sparked by a series of articles written by Edward Hunter, a former CIA analyst turned news reporter, the brainwashing sensation offered a reassuring interpretation of these unpatriotic reports. The soldiers in question, Hunter explained, had been subject to brainwashing, which is a new technique of psychological warfare developed by Moscow and now employed by the partisans of international communism around the world, such as China, whose revolution had occurred a year before. So it was through the machinations of their captors, no agency of their own, this foreign ideology subverted and replaced the democratic ideas and values formerly held by these American soldiers. So it's the power of the ideas in question that in effect revolutionized their outlook. This idea that ideas themselves can take control of an individual's mind and transform beliefs, values, and behavior is a part of Hofstadter's paranoid style, because it saturated early Cold War politics and culture. In the late 1940s and early 50s, for example, the trials of State Department officer Alger Hiss, accused of communism by the former communist Whittaker Chambers, riveted the nation. Chambers' Witness was the best-selling book in the summer of 1952. Berkeley physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, again, who was recruited by Conant to lead the Manhattan Project, was also accused of being communist, first in 1949 and then again in widely publicized hearings in 1954. As a result, and despite James Conant's efforts to defend his former chief physicist, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission revoked Oppenheimer's security credentials. Together with federal, state, and campus-level investigations into communist teachers, all of these sensational trials added credibility to what I'm calling the brainwashing idea. The paranoid warnings from J. Edgar Hoover and Senator Joseph McCarthy and other anti-communists were perhaps not so exaggerated and not so unreasonable. If ideas could be so powerful, then anyone, regardless of their professionalism, their intelligence, such as Oppenheimer, or the degree of their patriotism, such as these soldiers in Korea, could fall into communism's ideological clutches and be transformed into a different kind of person. The brainwashing idea, as I'm calling it, also saturated American popular and economic culture. On the left is Hunter's book, his original book from 1951. But as the 50s go on, you can see the idea seeping, I claim, more broadly into American culture through the then growing self-help industry. Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking. If you glance at this book, it has you repeating things over and over to convince yourself that you're powerful and you're strong and so forth, sort of self-brainwashing. Into economics with Vance Packard's The Hidden Persuaders, which argue that retailers and advertisers are using Freudian images and words to, without you being aware of it, convince you to buy their product. And then the iconic Manchurian Candidate in the novel written by Richard Condon in 1959, which I will get to. The brainwashing idea, as I'm calling it, also animates the structure of scientific revolutions, beginning with that famous first sentence. Note that Kuhn does not say anything like we are mistaken in our understanding of how science works. He says rather that a false image has a hold of us. It possesses us. And it will continue to control our thinking about science until that image is replaced by another, namely Kuhn's. That's what he's offering us. That is completely different and incompatible. Until, that is, our understanding of science undergoes something like a paradigm shift. Now, the coincidence that Kuhn's book was published in 1962, the same year that John Frankenheimer released the film version of The Manchurian Candidate, would be merely suggestive, because Structure, of course, was published in 1962. Were it not that Kuhn's depiction of professional scientists is so similar, I think, to the film's depiction of the victims of brainwashing. This is most prominent in Kuhn's essay, The Function of Dogma in Scientific Research, a paper from 1961 that Kuhn designed to introduce Structure's new theory of science. And he read it in England just about a year before Structure came out. Now, Kuhn's interest in this paper was the temperament of professional scientists, whose dogmatic, that's his word, their dogmatic cast of mind played an essential function in preparing for scientific revolutions. Supposedly, Kuhn wrote, the scientist is the explorer of nature, or the uncommitted searcher after truth. This is the popular image of the scientist. The man who rejects prejudice at the threshold of his laboratory, who collects and examines the bare and objective facts, and whose allegiance is to such facts and them alone. But all that is wrong, Kuhn says. The truth is that though the scientific enterprise may be open-minded, the individual scientist is very often not. Whether his work is predominantly theoretical or experimental, he usually seems to know. Before his research project is well underway, all of the most intimate details of the result which that project will achieve. How then does a community of scientists become to be so focused, so confident, and in Kuhn's word, dogmatic about their beliefs and methods? Well, Kuhn's answer is through science education. Far from cultivating critical independence of mind, scientific education, in fact, is, quote, a relatively dogmatic initiation into a pre-established problem-solving tradition that the student is neither invited nor equipped to evaluate. Science education is paradigmatic indoctrination. Through repeated drills and exercises, students learn to see the world through the dominant paradigm and adopt, quote, a deep commitment to a particular way of viewing the world and of practicing science in it. Once acquired, paradigms maintain this dogmatism throughout scientists' careers for three reasons, briefly. First, they are exclusive, again, that other element of the paranoid style I introduced, meaning that a scientific community can have only one, and Kuhn explicitly says that in the structure. Second, their success at solving problems reminds scientists that they are true and probably will never be replaced. And finally, paradigms are the basis of professional life. So when crisis and anomaly looms, Kuhn writes, scientists often become defensive or dogmatic, because they are defending, quote, neither more nor less than the basis of their professional way of life. Now, dogmatism, of course, was only part of Kuhn's story. It gives way, this dogmatism gives way when crisis and revolutionary science unfold. At least some scientists become more exploratory and critical about the paradigms on offer. Still, as Kuhn's many liberal critics would soon point out, this critical, creative, and open-minded mode of practicing science was exceptional. It was literally abnormal in Kuhn's account, because it has no part in normal science. Once a revolutionary successor paradigm has emerged, scientists either convert to the new paradigm or remain stubbornly in the old guard and end their careers along with the now obsolete paradigm. In all cases, as Kuhn describes science working, scientific thinking and experimentation takes place within a guiding system of ideas, a paradigm and its worldview. These parallels between the nature and function of communist ideology in brainwashing and paradigms in Kuhn's structure-era philosophy of science are illustrated, I think, by the famous opening dream sequence of The Manchurian Candidate. As the film begins, Frank Sinatra's character, Bennett Marco, a Korean War veteran, is asleep and experiencing a recurring nightmare.
The war in Korea was over. Captain, now Major Bennett Marco, had been reassigned to Army intelligence in Washington. It was, by and large, a pleasant assignment, except for one thing. Night after night, the Major was plagued by the same reoccurring nightmare.
Stop. Stop.
I know
modern discovery, which we owe to the hydrangea, concerns the influence of air drainage upon plant climates. Many years ago, when I was traveling about the country, I noticed magnificent hydrangeas on the hills, where the air drainage was perfect, and very poor specimens, or perhaps none at all, in the valleys. Formerly, we used to consider sheltered valleys more favorable to plants than hilltops. But the avoidance of late spring and early autumn frost enjoyed by sites with good air drainage, where the cold air can drain safely away to lower levels, gives the hills a decided advantage. Thus it was the hydrangeas that gave the first pointer in another modern discovery of horticultural importance. From this, it might appear that the hydrangea is a fairly simple plant, but there are more complications. The cultivation of hydrangeas was evolved from a number of varieties originally found in Japan, not all of which, of course, have the same characteristics. Two of them do not share the quality of producing blue flowers in mineral-rich soils.
Allow me to introduce our American visitors. I must ask you to forgive their somewhat lackadaisical manners, but I have conditioned them, or brainwashed them, which I understand is the new American word, to believe that they are waiting out a storm in the lobby of a small hotel in New Jersey, where a meeting of the Ladies' Garden Club is in progress.
You will notice that I have told them they may smoke. I've allowed my people to have a little fun in the selection of bizarre tobacco substitutes. Are you enjoying your cigarette, Ed?
Yes, ma'am. Yak dung. Oh, Daisy.
I will summarize. So the dream, as Frank Sinatra experiences it, recalls this boring lecture about hydrangeas, to which he and his fellow soldiers were subject as prisoners. Yet the camera's literal revolution around the room, reveals a revolution in understanding and perception. The real experience was a military meeting at which the diabolical military psychiatrist Dr. Lowe demonstrated his prowess as a brainwasher who has turned one of these soldiers into a political assassin, namely the one who we saw strangle his most liked fellow soldier. Now we, as viewers, are able to jump back and forth between these two incompatible gestalts, these two different versions of what occurred during this event. Dr. Lowe, for example, appears at one point in the hallucinatory hotel lobby where the matronly woman is formerly lecturing about hydrangeas. But it is understood that the GI's understanding and perceptions are not decomposable in this way. They are governed by, their understanding and their perception is governed by and contained within the gestalt that was created by the brainwashing. So understood, the film's portrayal of brainwashing and its effects meets Kuhn's account of normal science and revolutions, I think, at 5 interrelated points. First, that brainwashing is a conversion experience. These GIs have been transformed, as we saw, one of them into a killer. Throughout the structure of scientific revolutions, Kuhn similarly writes of scientists being converted, his word, to paradigms, and paradigm shifts as, quote, conversion experiences. Second, there's the suggestion that the implanted ideas control semantics. Words about brainwashing and psychological research in what really happened, according to the film, are heard and understood by these GIs as words about hydrangeas and their cultivation. Kuhn's paradigms, we know, similarly shape the meanings of scientific terms, so that when different paradigms become incommensurable, scientists can only, quote, talk through each other because the paradigms in question have shaped the semantics of common words in different ways. Third, the ideas control perception. Even though the GIs and this audience of Soviet and Manchurian military officers are in the same auditorium, they perceive it in completely different ways. In Kuhn, we know that scientists also perceive the world differently as they pass from one paradigm into another. Fourth, individual variations are expected. Momentarily, we didn't see it here, but for a moment, for example, one of the African American soldier on the far right looks to see the woman lecturing about hydrangeas, and she is black. And I don't think anyone would be surprised by that, because it's understood that the brainwashing weaves a subjective world for the victim out of the victim's experiences and preconceptions and expectations. Similarly, in structure, individual differences among scientists play an enormous role in determining how a scientific community is going to find its way out of the crisis when anomaly occurs. And finally, that all these influences are hidden or unconscious. Both Kuhn's scientists and Frankenheimer's soldiers are unaware that their thoughts and perceptions are so guided in this way. The GI's nightmares only hint that something happened that they do not remember. In Kuhn's case, as I said earlier, revolutions become invisible after scientific textbooks are rewritten and they reflect the newly dominant paradigm. This being one reason why it is history, and that famous first sentence, that can liberate us from the way our textbooks have indoctrinated us. Now, the claim is not that Structure's account of science itself contains or involves brainwashing as depicted in this political thriller. These GIs were brainwashed against their will and by the force of their captors. Kuhn expressly denies that that's what he's talking about. As he wrote in Structure, quote, "The transfer of allegiance from paradigm to paradigm is a conversion experience that cannot be forced. The scope of this allegiance is also reduced. While Hunter's captured soldiers were thought to be totally transformed into a different kind of person, Kuhn's scientific revolutions, again, are professional revolutions and transform their scientific understanding." I don't think these qualifications, however, go to the core of my claim, that this core idea of scientific revolutions as deeply personal cognitive conversion experiences is something that Kuhn borrowed from the surrounding Cold War culture and the paranoid style of thinking that surrounded him. When and how exactly did this and other elements of the paranoid style come into Kuhn's thinking? To answer this, we have to look at Kuhn's relationship to Conant. Kuhn was devoted to Conant and deeply impressed by his intelligence and acumen, but Kuhn did not aspire to be a public intellectual or a defender of science and democracy as Conant was. Yet, by emerging from within the constellation of values and concerns that Conant's historiography had embraced, Kuhn's thinking about science was nonetheless shaped by these political and epistemological concerns. One issue, for example, on which Kuhn and Conant came to disagree was the nature of scientific progress. While Kuhn originally followed Conant in understanding progress as a kind of a dialectical progression from one conceptual scheme to another, as you find out, you see in Conant's little book on understanding science, which was probably the first book in history of science Kuhn read in 1947. Kuhn decided that that was incorrect. And he decided that it was incorrect because he himself experienced a kind of transformative conversion experience in the summer of 1947, very shortly after starting to work with Conant, reading the history of science on his own. Conant had asked him to go look at the history of physics because Conant's specialty was chemistry and the history of chemistry. And that is when it happened. Kuhn later reflected, "I was sitting at my desk with the text of Aristotle's Physics open in front of me. Looking up, I gazed abstractedly out the window of my room. The visual image is one I still retain. Suddenly the fragments in my head sorted themselves out in a new way and fell into place together. My jaw dropped. For all at once, Aristotle seemed a very good physicist indeed, but of a sort I'd never dreamed possible. The experience, what Kuhn came to call the Aristotle experience, led him to decide that history of science is not a continuous accumulation of knowledge, because scientists like Aristotle and Newton were not engaged in the same kind of enterprise. They worked according to incompatible sets of intellectual values, goals, and metaphysical presuppositions, in something like, as Structure would later say, different worlds. So, the structure of scientific revolutions must be understood, at least in part, as Kuhn's effort to understand this revelation, and he called it a revelation, in fact, an effort to systematize its implications and develop a new understanding of science on its basis. So while one might conclude that this rejection of Conant's ideals of progress moved Kuhn away from Conant's very politicized conception of historiography of science, which I'm not really talking about here today, but I'll ask you to take my word for it. In fact, it moved Kuhn's developing image of science toward just a different kind of politics of knowledge. For in place of Conant's ideal of Wissenschaft as an open, continuously expanding and transparent field of human learning, the Aristotle experience pointed to a fragmentation of this field. A fragmentation that again points us to Hofstadter's paranoid style. For in this fragmented universe, mutually exclusive and irreconcilable worldviews do battle for winner-take-all supremacy. The way Kuhn described the experience itself, just the style of this prose, also draws upon a then prominent icon in Cold War anti-communism, the conversion narrative. Besides the brainwashing sensation, which I reviewed and showed you that bit from Manchurian Candidate, the conversion narrative animated a thriving genre of literature at the time, most of it mea culpa literature. In books, magazines, and newspaper articles, former communists, often intellectuals, established their liberal bona fides by describing their former communism as an infatuation, and how that infatuation came about, and more importantly, how they got over it. Often they described the sudden realization that communism's promises were deceptive or false. One popular account was from Arthur Koestler. Koestler was a Hungarian intellectual who, like Kuhn, was a physicist turned historian of science. In his classic novel Darkness at Noon, describes the plight of an imprisoned Bolshevik who only after his party had turned on him and imprisoned him did this Bolshevik, his name was Rubachev, did Rubachev experience the conversion and see, wow, what an idiot I was to be a communist. Yet it is Kessler's own personal account of these dynamics that seems to me strikingly Kuhnian. Writing in The God That Failed, a confession. This was a very popular book, a collection of conversion narratives by former intellectuals, published in 1950. Kessler describes the event occurring, once again, as he was reading. Tired of electrons and wave mechanics, I began for the first time to read Marx, Engels, and Lenin. This is a very young Kessler, by the way. In earnest, by the time I had finished with Feuerbach and State and Revolution, something had clicked in my brain which shook me like a mental explosion. To say that one had seen the light is a poor description of the mental rapture which only the convert knows, regardless of the faith he has been converted to. The new light seemed to pour from all directions across the skull. The whole universe falls into pattern like the stray pieces of a jigsaw puzzle assembled by magic at one stroke. Now, Kuhn did not become a dogmatic Aristotelian in the same way that Kessler, after this experience, did become a dogmatic convert to communism for years. But the revolutionary scientists that Kuhn describes in his book do experience the transformation, and they come to use similar language to describe it. Kuhn wrote, quote, "Scientists often speak of the scales falling from their eyes, or the, quote, lightning flash that inundates a previously obscure puzzle. So I submit that the Aristotle experience suggests one avenue by which these Cold War themes and tropes came to leave their mark on structure. For after experiencing something like a revolutionary intellectual conversion, Kuhn pursued the hunch that scientific change itself was a similar revolutionary process by which one entire constellation of understanding was suddenly replaced by another that was incompatible with the first. Kuhn himself said that the Aristotle experience led him to read far and wide in sociology, psychology, and philosophy in search of illuminating tools to make good on his hunch. He found many in Piaget, Ludwig Fleck, and later in the 1950s in Wittgenstein, and also in his colleague Jerome Bruner's psychology experiments in perception. Yet none of these sources, I believe, are likely to have supplied Kuhn with this crucial idea that scientists, either individually or in groups, are prone to such intellectually transformative experiences. The plausibility of this idea, it seems to me, could only have come from the surrounding Cold War culture that was, as we have seen, awash with concerns about ideological conversion, either sudden and accidental or induced by others. It's not necessary, though, to offer any special explanation for why Kuhn might have taken very seriously the possibility that a system of ideas can be so powerful and transformative. As if the brainwashing idea belonged only to sensational or tabloid headlines. For these ideas were then taken seriously by some very intelligent and influential people. During the same years that Kuhn worked with Conant at Harvard, for example, Conant engaged the brainwashing idea as it played out in the controversy over communist teachers. Though Conant had been quick to defend the rights of faculty against anti-communist investigations and the institution of loyalty oaths, which was a practice in the United States, Conant decided by the end of 1949 that the hardline anti-communists were in fact right. Faculty who were members of the Communist Party had no valid place on American campuses. They were, as Conant's biographer put it, quote, beyond the pale as teachers. A statement from the National Education Association, in which Conant was not just a member, but pretty much the unacknowledged leader, offers a popular rationale. Quote, the whole spirit of free American education will be subverted unless teachers are free to think for themselves. The brainwashing idea is unmistakable in this opinion. Communist intellectuals are not free to think, precisely and only because it is supposed that communist ideology has taken control of their intellectual faculties. Conant's conversion on this issue, according to his biographer, and according to me, because I've looked at the correspondence, was encouraged by NYU philosopher Sidney Hook, who was among the most vocal and influential of anti-communist academics during the Cold War. Note, please, the banner behind Hook. Hook's anti-communism offers us another version of the brainwashing idea. In his book, Heresy, Yes, Conspiracy, No, Hook argued that anti-communist ideology was no mere set of harmless ideas, even when viewed as heresies. Instead, communist ideology was part of a conspiracy, sponsored by Moscow, to subvert Western democracy and advance international communism. Communist faculty who were party members therefore deserved to lose their jobs, not on intellectual grounds, but rather on professional grounds, for they were not out to teach, but rather to brainwash and convert their students. Now, Hook expressly said that communist ideas are harmless on the previous slide, but he seemed to believe otherwise. Sorry, on this slide. We have no need to fear these arguments. But look at what he says about faculty who were not party members and therefore not supposedly required by Moscow to advance the communist cause. The problem with these so-called fellow travelers, Hooke said, was that their political thinking had been corrupted by certain ideas in their minds. Perhaps the most pressing feature of the habits of the fellow traveler is the unscrupulous character of his intellectual procedures as soon as he discusses a political question which concerns communists or the Soviet Union. A man who would rather starve than misreport the evidence of an experiment, who would sooner sacrifice popularity and preferment than risk making some snap judgment about a manuscript, feels not the slightest compunction once his political sympathies take on a communist tinge about inventing facts as he goes along, or refusing to investigate and verify evidence crucial to his arguments. Even worse, fellow travelers had no idea this, or had little idea this was happening to them, because this corruption was partly unconscious. Hooke continued, I'm not referring to deliberate duplicity on the part of these people. Rather, I am referring to the half-conscious belief born of political euphoria that everything goes because one knows in one's heart that it's a good cause, etc. Intellectual integrity thus becomes the first victim of political enthusiasm. Yet this political enthusiasm, Hooke admitted, was based on an intellectual conviction. Quote, an assumption deeply held, even when it is unspoken, that the communist movement is an integral element in the wider movement of progress and enlightenment. So Hooke's fellow traveling professors meant well, but like Frankenheimer's soldiers, they were victims of an idea that had disabled their critical intellects and forced them to see the political world in only one communist-friendly way. So when I say that Kuhn adopted the paranoid style or elements of it, or that he incorporated the brainwashing idea, I am certainly not complaining, as would be false, that Kuhn went looking for this idea outside of science. These ideas came to him in the sense that Conan, whom Kuhn especially respected and considered a brilliant intellect, and other prominent intellectuals took these ideas seriously. That said, I have not found evidence of conversations between Kuhn and Conan, or anyone else for that matter, expressly about this thing I'm calling the brainwashing idea. But I'm not convinced that such independent evidence is necessary. For the more closely we attend to the Cold War context and the language and the reasoning of this book, the structure of scientific revolutions itself can be understood as joining Hofstadter's famous essay in an attempt to normalize the paranoid style of belief that dominated the Cold War. This is not to say that Kuhn himself was a political paradigm or even a staunch anti-communist. It is not his personal politics, but rather the politics of an era that left its mark on this famous book, as Kuhn appropriated the brainwashing idea and the paranoid style for intellectual, not political ends. As he explained in The Function of Dogma, his new theory of science explained how it can be that, quote, though a quasi-dogmatic commitment is, on one hand, a source of resistance and controversy, it is also instrumental in making the sciences the most consistently revolutionary of all human activities. Where Hofstadter argued that fears of revolutionary world-changing ideologies were just a recurring feature of American politics, Kuhn argued that revolutionary world-changing paradigms were a permanent and essential feature of science in the advancement of knowledge. Thank you very much.
Okay, if you have questions. If you have questions, please raise your hand and the microphone will be brought to your place in the room. And if those of you who are watching us from a distance have any questions, they'll be relayed to George Reich as soon as possible. Hans?
Okay, I'm taking my life in my hands. Is it working okay?
Yeah, very well.
I wonder if you could say something about brainwashing itself as conceived in the 1950s at this time. I was a kid when I saw The Manchurian Candidate. And as I recall, which is a very long time ago, so my memory may be faulty, was it the parents of the assassin who were controlling him?
That's right.
Right, and didn't the mother bring out a deck of cards and that would sort of put him into a trance or something like that?
The Queen of Diamonds
But the thing...
was a trigger for the conditioning that had been instilled.
Oh, I see, okay. Well, I was thinking, I wonder to what extent the analogy would hold between brainwashing, at least as conceived in The Manchurian Candidate, and the Kuhnian case, because the assassin needed the trigger. He would go into this kind of trance-like state, but a Kuhnian normal scientist doesn't. Well, I suppose you have sort of daily life, and then you suddenly go into quantum mechanical mode, and it might be something like a trance. But to what extent might there be an analogy or disanalogy? And more generally, what's the conception of brainwashing like that's playing a role here?
I think the idea would be that normal science is in a loose sense, a brainwashed state of a community of practitioners.
24 hours a day.
And because that's why Kuhn reaches to the word world. It is the world in which you live in. I mean, of course, he later abandoned that sort of hyperbolic language, but at the time, it was how he understood it. There were no triggers that brought the conditioning in, as in the Hollywood version, but there was a trigger to bring you out, and that is the anomaly. When nature hits and your paradigm doesn't work anymore, that sort of brings you out of this confidence and this dogmatism and triggers a new mode, revolutionary science, and hopefully the scientific community moves on. So that's how you get this wonderful sense of, even though, Kuhn just loved these ironies, that we're all brainwashed, yet we're making this fantastic intellectual progress. That fascinated him at the time.
Question in the middle of the room?
First of all, thank you for the wonderful lecture. I really enjoyed it. My question is related to the idea of the paranoid style in America, maybe the way that the Americans view the other. In this case, you're talking about the Red Scare, or the fear of the communists, right? So you had some case studies there. But do you see that paranoid style being continued up to date? For example, the way that the foreign policy is viewing other countries. First of all, the threat of the world weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which led to the wars. And right now, maybe what's going on with Iran and the political views that, for example, Canada has recently written on its foreign affairs website that Iran is the biggest threat to world security or something. Like having these icons of terrorism and, I don't know, that Islamophobia, that you have sort of, do you see it up to today, the thesis that you have?
I don't want to speak to that in any official sense because that's today, and I'm trying to look at the history of this book. But I think I'll speak for Richard Hofstadter, put it that way, and say he would not be surprised at all that, again, these tropes and themes in the manner in which America in particular deals with these political issues remains in place. Yeah, I would consent to that.
Question in the back?
I had a question about where you're going with Kuhn's Aristotle experience. So you sort of have this brainwashing narrative, conversion narrative, but then you're saying that Kuhn was converted by his Aristotle experience. So I thought you were trying to develop some sort of higher order thing here. So normal science is brainwashed, but then is there something going on at the philosophy of science level? Because it seems like Kuhn's was converted by this experience and then could see the world.
Well, perhaps there's two senses of conversion going on here. I pitched the Aristotle experience as a conversion experience, where Kuhn himself moved from this classical understanding of physics, according to which he says Aristotle never made sense to him, to this new view where Aristotle suddenly makes great sense. So that's a conversion experience that I said was part of the Cold War discourse, if you will. It's a common element. But then perhaps the other confusing sense of conversion is, and you're right, I'm claiming that experience converted him to a new model of science that he started to develop in the structure of scientific revolutions, according to which that's how science works. And Kuhn says this. When he reflects on that experience, I only showed one quote here, but over the course of his career, he comes back 6, 8, 10 times to it. And he says his historiography is based on the idea that what happened to him on that very special day was a kind of recapitulation or a reenactment of what happened hundreds of years ago with historical scientists. It's philosophy of history that, I don't know if Kuhn knew this or not, but it comes from Robin Collingwood. The idea that all historiography is a kind of reenactment in one's mind of what your historical subjects went through. And that Kuhn found himself there. I don't know if that helps or not. That would be my guess.
Further questions?
So I really liked your talk. I thought it was very, very interesting. In particular, I really like the kind of analogy of brainwashing, how a scientist really does see his world in terms of the paradigm that he's living in. So the questions that he asks, what he thinks is relevant for study, how he's going to address those questions, they're all built into the scientific paradigm that he's working in. And I don't know of any modern examples of kind of scientists facing a paradigm shift and kind of resisting it. Although I think with Einstein's theory there were some, but if you take the Copernican revolution, that fundamentally changed the worldview. It changed where the center of the universe was. It changed how we can interact with God in a sense, because God used to be out there, but now we're going around the sun, so where does God exist? And that seems to be very good evidence, this resistance that many scientists have towards new paradigms, new ways of viewing the universe, seems very supportive of your thesis.
Well, thank you, but I would want to qualify my thesis and say that I do think scientists can be dogmatic and defensive, but only in the trivial sense that we all are, I think. I mean, if you as a philosopher were suddenly confronted by some very smart undergraduate who said, in these 3 lines I just disproved your entire career, you'd be like, that can't be right. I'll look at it, but you're going to be skeptical about it. That's trivial, and that's also not because some idea has taken control of your mind and forced you to see the world in a certain way.
Okay.
So I follow what you say, but I would qualify that, and perhaps the first question this connects to too, this really is history. I mean, I personally do not believe, no psychologist believes that brainwashing has any credibility. It is not a recognized phenomenon. And that's why I really want to capture it as part of a style of thinking of the time that I don't think has much credibility now. But perhaps someone in the back looks like they're skeptical.
I think we have at least 4 questions now, so we'll start with Henrik.
I just pushed it. Oh, with that. So, thank you very much. I also enjoyed your talk a lot. So, although to be a little negative, sorry, but it's a very nice story, and but it strikes me as sort of circumstantial in its evidence. You tell these parallel stories. Could you tell me more about? Is there any direct sort of historical evidence for your thesis that Kuhn actually sort of said or documented that he was inspired by the political development and the vote, the Manchurian candidate, or something like that?
No, certainly not looking to Hollywood. I mean, that would be quite unscholarly, wouldn't it?
Well, they came out at the same time, but the book, I guess, came out earlier.
I think there's, it is, I agree with you, it's a circumstantial case. There's much more suggestive bits of circumstantial evidence that I think add weight. I gave you just two. Well, first of all, there's the defense in structure itself of why he's appealing to this political analogy. And he explains the logic. I mean, really, the whole business that I presented about going into Richard Hofstadter is in that two paragraphs where Kuhn says, look, there's a precise analogy, step by step, for why we have to have scientific revolutions that follows the explanation for why sometimes we have to have political revolutions, including communication breakdown, including changing sets of assumptions for how the world works, incommensurability, political conflict, and so forth. So there's that. There's much more language. If you go through the Google version, or the Google Books version, for words like grip and mind, Kuhn is frequently talking about, a paradigm and its hold on the mind and the way it grips the mind. That language, I think, is unmistakably rooted in this time. And you could say it's just a style. It doesn't mean anything more, but I don't think that's true. One potential smoking gun, in fact, it'll take me too long, I can show it to you. In his papers there are notes on an obscure German historian named Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy, who wrote a book in the 1930s called The European Revolutions. And the gist of Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy's theory, it was a theory of European history, and it said modern Europe is forged through a series of revolutions, and he identified about 10 of them. And the essential features of this model were that each revolution is an abrupt break, where textbooks are rewritten, new styles of thought and thinking emerge in each epoch, and you have sort of in microcosm, say, a picture of the history of science, as Kuhn conceives it, from paradigm to paradigm. So Kuhn is assiduously taking notes on this book.
This is something we know he read.
We know he read from his archival papers, that's right. But it does not make an appearance in structure. So yeah, circumstantial, yes. I agree.
Okay, we have several more questions. I don't know where the microphone's going next. Okay, to the back of the room.
You sort of just spoke to this with what you just said, but my question is kind of the flip side of asking whether you've seen this kind of paranoia carried forward into more recent times. To ask, have you looked in the history of philosophy to see maybe other times when philosophical trends have paralleled perhaps times of political paranoia, transformations of societies or empires or whatnot?
No, that's a good question. I have not, but the obvious place to start would be about 25, 30 years before, when, around in the wake of 1917, when the first Red Scare really gripped the United States. And that was a time when philosophy was just professionalizing, so there would be the national societies were then having discussions about what philosophy is and what it's going to do. And I just don't know if there was talk then. Yeah, that's a suggestive question. I mean, a lot of these people were leftists. I mean, Dewey was, for example, very leftist, sympathetic to Marxism. They all made sojourns to the Soviet Union. So, yeah, what exactly you find, though, I can't say.
Okay, next question.
Yes, I find your talk really interesting and deep, but what confuses me is actually the explicitly religious terminology that comes from the Kuhn. I'm not prepared to say that. So the explicitly religious, because dogma, conversion, those terms come from Christian narratives. So, I mean, you could argue that this is a kind of American paranoid way of thinking, but isn't it ultimately an Augustinian or even a Pauline way of thinking?
Yeah, I think that is possible. I haven't. I would not want to lean the whole. I would not want to say that these elements of the structure of scientific revolutions are all attributable to the Augustinian tradition or to American history writ large like that. But I do agree that in American history and the history of revivals, this is Hofstadter again. This is Hofstadter's picture of anti-intellectualism in American life. That it is punctuated by these kinds of spiritual revolutions. I don't see Kuhn paying much attention to that, and I don't see it surrounding him that much. But of course, you could say, well, he's at Harvard in New England, which is in many ways ground zero of that element of American history. Yeah. So I'm open to the idea that there are other strands that could be worked into a more complete account. I don't think those would substitute for the high anxiety stakes that were on campus, for example, at the time.
Okay. Hi. As you mentioned, sort of later in life, Kuhn backed off from at least some of the rhetoric.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you see that as a change of mind on his part, or if you see that as him sort of coming to terms with his rhetoric was maybe, he seemed concerned that the movement that seemed to have followed him actually was not something that he could endorse. Right? So is that a change of mind for him, do you think, or?
It's complicated. There are several changes in mind. He came to reject the theory of paradigms, as you know, and he wanted to change the course of the ship and give it a different name, these disciplinary matrices, which I don't know how successful that was or not, but he specifically rejected the idea that paradigms are monolithic and non-decomposable. There's an argument in the archives between, when James Conant read Structure, he literally said, and my friend Gary Hardcastle compared this to someone going up to Tennessee Williams and saying, I love the play, but the character of Blanche has got to go. Conant said, love your new book, but you got to get rid of the paradigms. In so many words, that's what he said. And Kuhn's response was, what Conant proposed was, break these things up. Talk about formalisms, talk about climates of opinion, talk about practices and methods, and how they all kind of hang together. But why do you have to talk about these paradigm things over and over and over? I mean, he really hated the theory of paradigms. And Kuhn, in reply, says, no, I don't know how I would begin to break them up. He was committed to the idea of this holistic structure that guided scientific thought. That's exactly what he changed his mind on when he's talking about disciplinary matrices, which have either 3 or 4 parts, depending upon which description you read, about 8 to 10 years later. So he came back on that. Then, even as late as the foreword to Honig and Huna's reconstruction of this book, he's emphasizing, by the way, the conversion experience business, I'm done with that. So he is kind of progressively pushing this away and moving, as we know, into a different style, sort of a more Wittgensteinian philosophy of language approach to understanding science.
Could that be because of just the passing of time and when was this, in the 70s or?
Yes, the paper Second Thoughts on Paradigms was published in 1970. Passing of time, I mean, I think I know what you're getting at, and I mean, this is speculative, but I do think that Kuhn probably looked at this book and thought, I myself was kind of caught up in this exaggerated insistence on this style. And now that the world has calmed down a little bit, I'm going to refine it and throw some of it out. That is how I see it, but I don't have, I haven't worked that out yet as to exactly how that happened, but I think that's what did happen here.
Amy?
Thanks for this round. Yeah, thank you for the talk. I found it really interesting. And I was wondering if, so when I read your book on the Cold War in philosophy, your earlier book there, I thought that you made a lot of really powerful insights regarding how these larger cultural, sociological, I don't know how to say, structures changed the way philosophy of science was done, the structure of the community itself. And I'm wondering if, and you sort of mentioned that in regards to this talk, like the imposition of cultural binary, the conversion experience. And I'm wondering if you have an idea yet of something like that in regards to this project, and if there's kind of continuum in your thought between some of your earlier work and some of this work.
Yeah, there's, I think what your comments sparked to my mind is my interest in the popularity of this book and how the book, even though everyone admits was not entirely original, there are many other writers at the time working in the same themes, some of which Kuhn in fact nods to and borrows from. Somehow this book crystallized and captured imaginations and almost allegiance of so many people and so many different kinds of professions. So there I do see a kind of a restructuring taking place. I mean, there's the fable told of, after reading The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, social scientists were eager because now they realized all they need is a paradigm, and they'll suddenly get funding and respect. Just like the physicists, or the economists saying that, so we won't be so dismal anymore once we make it clear what our paradigm is. So that would be one example. I do not have any general theory of, there might be something latent in my own style of thought, but I'm not promoting a theory of how intellectual history unfolds beyond looking at these intriguing particulars.
Are there further questions? But I hope you'll join me in thanking our speakers.